Welcome everyone to the deep dive. It's wonderful to have you with us today as we explore something truly foundational, something that speaks directly to our core mission here at Our True Identity. We're all about understanding the truth of God's word, how he moves through history, and how that truth helps us replace maybe some of the lies we might believe about ourselves or even about God's involvement or lack thereof in the world.
That's right. And it's such a privilege to be here sharing this journey with you all. We're the authors of In the Fullness of Time, which traces God's incredible preparation for Christ year by year. And we're excited to be joining you weekly to unpack a chapter.
And this week we're diving into chapter 5. The year is 10 BC. Now, on the surface, you might think, 10 BC? What happened then? It seems, well, almost unremarkable.
It really does, at first glance. You won't find 10 BC headlining many history books. Roman records show no, earth-shattering battles, no massive political coups that year. It feels quiet. But as we dug into it for the book, we found that beneath those quiet, mundane rhythms of daily life, something truly monumental was stirring. It was like a hinge, a hidden hinge of history. Heaven was actively, carefully setting the stage.
That's exactly why this deep dive feels so important for us today. Our goal is to really pull out the key insights from 10 BC, using In the Fullness of Time as our guide, and help you see just how divinely orchestrated this seemingly minor year actually was. We want to show you how, even though Roman historians might have just put a little footnote somewhere, this year was actually full of what we call assurance and quiet submission in God's grand story of redemption.
Yes, and those aren't just, abstract theological terms. Assurance really speaks to the solid bedrock of God's promises, even when things seem delayed. His plan is unfolding. And quiet submission, well, that's about the humble, often unseen ways hearts and circumstances were being prepared. It's the obedience happening off stage, if you will. So, we invite you today to explore this hidden architecture of redemption with us. 10 BC wasn't about thunder and lightning. It was about subtle, profound groundwork. We'll look at the political currents, the social atmosphere, the spiritual longing, all converging for God's purpose.
It's about seeing God's truth, his active hand, woven into the ordinary fabric of time. And hopefully that helps replace any lies we might hold on to, lies about history being just random chaos, or God being distant, or his plan not being personal and detailed.
Beautifully put. It's about seeing his intimate involvement.
Okay then, let's jump in. Let's unpack this quiet but powerful year, starting perhaps with the dominant force of the era, the Roman world. An empire that, as you say, was unknowingly preparing the way, even for a message it would eventually try to silence. The Roman world. An empire unknowingly preparing the way. All right, so Rome in 10 BC. The big story is the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But it wasn't exactly cuddly peace, was it? More like peace through power, a controlled calm.
That's a very good way to put it. It's absolutely fascinating, especially when you layer on the perspective of God's providence. You have Augustus, Julius Caesar's adopted son, who had by this point undeniably reshaped the entire Roman world. Think about it. The generations of brutal civil war that tore the Republic apart, they were over. Done. By 10 BC, Rome wasn't really a republic anymore, not in practice. It was an empire, and its heartbeat, according to the wisdom, really, of one man, Caesar Augustus.
And the Senate. Once the center of power and debate.
It had become, well, largely ceremonial. A chamber of, as we described it, formality and quiet submission. The real decisions, the real power, rested solely with Augustus. He was, without question, the uncontested master of the known world. His authority was absolute.
Stable, secure, unquestioned.
Exactly. And this stability, this sheer concentration of power, even though born from an iron fist, ironically created a global environment where a very different kind of kingdom, God's kingdom, could eventually spread.
It's incredible. And he wasn't just ruling, he was actively shaping Roman identity, wasn't he? His face was on the coins, he reformed the calendar, he famously boasted about rebuilding Rome from brick to marble.
He left his imprint everywhere. Poets like Virgil and Horace sang his praises. Priests offered sacrifices invoking his genius or spirit. And there was this constant whisper of divinity around him. Not quite official deification in Rome yet, but the language was there. It was almost as if he was trying to be the savior Rome craved, crafting this very human-centered story of peace and restoration.
A human attempt at salvation, which, as you say, sort of primed the pump for the real thing, even as a counterfeit.
Precisely. But back to the Pax Romana itself. You're right. It wasn't peace through harmony or mutual understanding. It was peace by control. It was the silence that falls after a conquest. The order imposed after rebellion is brutally crushed.
Enforced by the legions.
Always the legions. Their presence was constant, a visible reminder of Rome's power. That gleaming armor wasn't just for show, it represented overwhelming force. Yet even under the shadow of this imposed peace, this groundwork was being laid for a kingdom that wouldn't arrive with swords and shields, but with, well, a baby in a manger. This earthly peace, achieved through might, became the unintended platform for spreading news of a heavenly peace.
Which leads right into the idea of the imperial cult and the civic theology. Where did the push to see Augustus as more than human come from? Was it just flattery or something more strategic?
It was definitely strategic. A truly brilliant political innovation from a purely human standpoint. By 10 BC, the reverence for Augustus was just growing and growing across the vast empire. In some of the eastern provinces, places with a longer tradition of ruler worship, they were already openly worshiping him as Divus Augustus, basically Augustus the god, even while he was alive.
Wow, even before he died.
Oh, yes. Now, in Rome itself, Augustus was more careful. He maintained the fiction of being the princeps, the first citizen, not a king or a god. But even there, the lines between honoring him, venerating his family, and outright deification were becoming increasingly blurred. The imperial cult was this clever mechanism that fused piety with patriotism. Loyalty became a form of liturgy. You didn't just obey the empire, you showed your loyalty by participating in rituals honoring its leader, his family, and the genius of Rome. It was a powerful glue for holding together such a diverse, sprawling territory.
So it essentially taught people peace comes from the state, salvation is provided by the emperor, he's the mediator between us and the divine, or at least he guarantees divine favor.
Exactly. He's the source of stability, prosperity, security. He's the one who ensures the gods are pleased with Rome. You can see how this sets up a major clash down the line, can't you?
Absolutely. Because when the early Christians start proclaiming Jesus as Kyrios, as Lord.
It's not just a theological statement in a vacuum. It's a direct political challenge. It's saying, no, Caesar is not the ultimate source of peace and salvation. Jesus is. This claim would be seen as subversive, treasonous even, precisely because the imperial cult had so effectively merged political loyalty with religious devotion. The seeds of that future conflict, that deadly confrontation, were already being sown in the soil of 10 BC, as the world was conditioned to look to a human ruler for its ultimate hope. It's one of those foundational lies about identity and salvation that the gospel came to overturn.
And thinking about the future, Augustus himself was obsessed with legacy, wasn't he? He built this empire, but ensuring it lasted beyond him was crucial. His dynastic planning, that wasn't just personal ambition, was it? It sounds like it was tied into this whole civic theology.
It absolutely was. The stability of Rome, its perceived divine favor, seemed to depend on a smooth succession. Augustus, famously, had no biological son of his own. This was a huge source of anxiety for him and for Rome, so he poured enormous energy into grooming successors. His stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus the Elder, were key military commanders, and then there were his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, sons of his daughter Julia and his close friend Agrippa. They were adopted by Augustus and marked for the highest honors. It was all about ensuring Rome had a future savior figure from his line.
And right in the middle of all this careful planning, in 10 BC, a specific baby is born within the imperial family Germanicus.
Yes, Germanicus, born in 10 BC. His father was Drusus the Elder, Augustus's beloved stepson, who was campaigning in Germania at the time. His mother was Antonia Minor, daughter of Mark Antony and Augustus's sister Octavia. So he was nephew to the future emperor Tiberius, great-nephew to Augustus himself. Talk about being born into the purple.
Destined for glory, you'd think. Beloved by the people later on. He must have seemed like the hope for Rome's future.
He certainly represented that hope for many. He grew up to be a popular general, known for his relatively good character compared to some others in the family. His premature death later on would indeed make him this enduring symbol of lost potential, of what might have been for Rome. He was celebrated, born into power, expected to carry the torch. But his life, though significant in Roman history, ultimately wouldn't bring the kind of transformation the world truly needed.
And here's that contrast again, that divine juxtaposition.
Exactly. While Rome celebrates the birth of Germanicus, destined for earthly glory but ultimately fleeting fame, God's plan is unfolding in utter obscurity. Another child, not yet born, destined for a manger, not a palace, would enter the world under the most opposite conditions imaginable. Poor, unnoticed on the margins. And it would be this child, Jesus, who would truly change everything, not through legions, but through love and sacrifice. It's that great reversal, God choosing the humble, the unexpected, to accomplish his greatest work. It challenges our human assumptions about where real power and significance lie.
It's just wow. Okay, so Rome's human plans, their political structures, even their family lines, all moving forward. What about their cultural achievements? The Ara Pacis, the altar of Augustan peace, was nearing completion around 10 BC. That sounds like more than just art.
Oh, much more. The Urapachus was a masterpiece, yes, but it was also profound propaganda and theology rendered in marble. Commissioned a few years earlier after Augustus returned from campaigns in Spain and Gaul, it was this huge, intricately carved altar complex. Imagine seeing it then, gleaming white marble, panels depicting scenes that blended Roman mythology with current events. You'd see figures representing Roman virtues, depictions of Augustus and his family leading religious processions, scenes suggesting he'd restored a kind of golden age, a divine harmony. It was a powerful statement. Augustus brought peace, divinely ordained peace.
Art, propaganda, theology, all rolled into one, a monument to Roman self-assurance.
Precisely. For a Roman citizen, standing before it must have been awe-inspiring, a tangible symbol of the security and order Augustus had established after decades of chaos, a declaration of Rome's power and destiny.
But, as we explore in the book, for those looking deeper, for those with spiritual eyes, it was incomplete, a shadow.
Exactly. A beautiful shadow, perhaps, but a shadow nonetheless. It represented the best kind of peace humanity could engineer: external order, stability enforced by power. But it couldn't touch the deeper issues. It couldn't atone for sin. It couldn't reconcile a person to God. It couldn't heal the brokenness within the human heart or speak to that sense of exile from the divine. The peace it proclaimed was real in a political sense, but it was a counterfeit of the true shalom, the deep holistic peace that God was preparing to offer. That peace would come not from an altar built by an emperor, but from a sacrifice made by God's own Son. It highlights the difference between the world's solutions and God's solution, between outward appearances and inward reality, a core theme for understanding our true identity in Christ versus the world's definitions.
And Rome wasn't just building monuments, it was actively expanding. Drusus, Germanicus's father, was campaigning deep in Germania in 10 BC, just military conquest or something more in the divine plan.
Well, from a Roman perspective, it was military conquest. Drusus was pushing the Roman frontier further into Germania than ever before. He was incredibly popular, admired by Augustus, seen as embodying Roman virtue and military prowess. Now, historically, Roman control there proved temporary. The legions would eventually suffer devastating defeats. But from the perspective of providence, these campaigns and Roman expansion in general had a deeper significance. Think about the logistics involved. The relentless march of legions, yes, but also the meticulous building of roads, those famous paved Roman roads, the drawing of maps, the establishment of forts and supply lines, the securing of ports.
Infrastructure.
Exactly. Infrastructure that the Romans built for their own imperial purposes, moving troops, collecting taxes, facilitating trade. But in God's economy, these very roads, these secure routes, these common languages, they were becoming the unintended highways for the gospel.
So Drusus thought he was conquering Germania for Rome.
But God was preparing pathways for Paul and other missionaries centuries later. When the time was right for Christ's message to spread rapidly across the Mediterranean world and into Europe, the physical and cultural infrastructure was largely in place, thanks to Rome.
Including language.
Absolutely crucial. Koine Greek, the common Greek spoken throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, thanks to Alexander the Great's earlier conquests and Rome's administration, had become the lingua franca. It was a language of trade, culture, and administration. And it would become the primary language of the New Testament. Paul writing his letters, the gospel writers recording Jesus' life and teachings, evangelists preaching in marketplaces from Antioch to Athens to Rome. They could use Greek to communicate with diverse audiences across vast distances. This linguistic unity was an incredible, divinely orchestrated tool for the rapid dissemination of the gospel.
It really is this undeniable paradox, isn't it? Rome, the empire that would eventually become the great persecutor of the early church, was, in 10 BC, unknowingly laying the groundwork, paving the roads, standardizing the language, creating the very conditions that would allow the Christian message to spread like wildfire.
It's one of the most profound examples of God's sovereignty over history. He uses the plans and ambitions of empires, even those indifferent or hostile to him, to accomplish his own redemptive purposes. Every road built, every port secured, every common language adopted, it all contributed to a world uniquely prepared for the arrival and rapid expansion of a message that would ultimately offer a truth and an identity far more lasting than Rome's. It gives you such assurance that God is always working, weaving his purposes, even through seemingly secular events.
Yeah.
The Jewish world, a people aching for deliverance.
Okay, so that sets a vivid picture of the Roman world, powerful, organized, expanding, yet unknowingly preparing the stage. Now let's shift our focus eastward, to Judea. What was the atmosphere there in 10 BC? King Herod the Great is still on the throne.
Yes, Herod is still ruling, though his reign is entering its later stages. He'd been in power for decades by this point, and while his health was likely beginning to decline, his ambition and, crucially, his paranoia were not. He was a complex figure, and a Idumean, technically Jewish by conversion, but always viewed with suspicion by many observant Jews as a usurper, fundamentally loyal to Rome, his benefactor. He was known for two things above all: his massive building projects and his chilling cruelty.
The building projects were incredible, weren't they? Transforming the landscape.
Absolutely. He built palaces and fortresses like Masada, Herodium, Jericho structures designed for both luxury and defense. He founded new cities. But his crowning achievement, still very much under construction in 10 BC, was the breathtaking reconstruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. It was a project of immense scale and grandeur, intended to win favor with his Jewish subjects and solidify his own legacy.
But the favor was hard to win, given his reputation.
Very hard. His brutality was legendary. He executed political rivals, members of the old Hasmonean dynasty, even members of his own family famously, his beloved wife Miriam and several of his sons. Driven by suspicion and fear of being overthrown, he ruled through fear as much as through administration.
And that fear, that paranoia about rivals, particularly about a prophesied king of the Jews, foreshadows something truly horrific later on.
It does. His deep-seated anxiety about a real king arising, one with a legitimate claim according to Jewish prophecy, would eventually, years after 10 BC, explode into that infamous violence, the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem, his desperate attempt to eliminate a perceived threat to his throne. In 10 BC, that specific horror is still in the future, but the seeds of that paranoia are deeply rooted in Herod's character and his tenuous hold on power. He's built with stone, trying to secure his legacy, unaware that the true king's arrival will be marked not by palaces, but by poverty and flight. It's another instance of human plans versus God's quiet, unexpected fulfillment.
Let's talk more about the temple. It was nearing completion, visually stunning. But you mentioned in the book, despite the grandeur, there was a sense of something missing.
Yes, this is crucial for understanding the spiritual climate. Herod's temple was, by all contemporary accounts, magnificent. One of the wonders of the ancient world. Its scale, the gold, the fine stonework, the sheer presence of it on the Temple Mount, it was designed to inspire awe. And it did. Pilgrims flocked to it. But within its courts, among the devout, many sensed a void. The physical structure was there, more glorious than ever, perhaps. But the presence, that was different. Unlike Solomon's temple centuries before, no visible glory cloud, the Shekinah, had descended to visibly fill the Holy of Holies when this temple was dedicated.
And no prophets.
Exactly. The voice of prophecy had been silent for centuries. Since Malachi, roughly 400 years earlier, there had been no widely recognized prophet speaking the direct, authoritative word of God to Israel. No divine voice piercing the silence within the most sacred space. There was meticulous ritual, yes. Sacrifices were offered according to the law. But that tangible sense of God's immediate, revealed presence felt distant, hidden.
A spiritual emptiness despite the physical splendor. That must have created a deep longing.
A profound ache. Yet, and this is equally important, the people didn't abandon hope. They still came. They clung fiercely to the Torah, the law of Moses. They observed the Sabbath, celebrated the feasts like Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles. They taught their children the stories of the Exodus, the covenant, the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David. They read the scrolls of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Zechariah, not just as history, but as promises still waiting, yearning for fulfillment.
So the silence wasn't interpreted as God's final word, his absence.
For the faithful, no. It wasn't absence. It felt more like imminence. Like a held breath. The very lack of a prophetic voice, the feeling of waiting, intensified the longing for God to act, to send the promised deliverer, the Messiah. This long silence, this period of waiting, was actually cultivating a deep spiritual readiness, a national yearning that would, hopefully, recognize the answer when it finally arrived. It counters the lie that God had forgotten his people. Rather, he was preparing them for something new.
And this longing wasn't uniform, was it? Different groups within Judaism had different ideas about who the Messiah would be, what his arrival would look like.
That's right. Jewish society in 10 BC was far from monolithic in its messianic expectations. You had several prominent groups with distinct views. The Pharisees, for example, were highly influential, especially among the common people. They were passionate defenders of both the written Torah and the oral traditions meant to elaborate and protect it. They emphasized ritual purity, Sabbath observance, tithing. Their zeal was often sincere.
And their hope for Messiah.
They generally believed that if Israel could just achieve perfect obedience to the law, then God would send the Messiah to deliver them from foreign rule and establish his kingdom. It was a hope tied strongly to national righteousness, sometimes focusing more on the how of observance than the why of God's grace. It was a subtle lie that human effort could trigger divine action, rather than divine action meeting human need.
Okay, then the Sadducees. A different group entirely.
Very different. They were largely the priestly aristocracy, wealthier, more politically connected, especially with the temple hierarchy and, by extension, with Roman authorities. They controlled the temple operations. Theologically, they were conservative in a different way. They accepted only the written Torah, the first 5 books, as authoritative and notably rejected core beliefs held by the Pharisees and others, like the resurrection of the dead, the existence of angels, or a detailed afterlife. For them, faith seemed more about maintaining the current order, the temple system, the traditions. Their hope was less about a future, radical divine intervention, and more about preserving their own position and stability. Their pragmatic, this worldly focus was another lie, obscuring the coming spiritual revolution.
And the Essenes. They were separate again.
Yes, the Essenes represented a more radical separatist response. Many withdrew from what they saw as the corruptions of temple worship in mainstream society. They formed communities in places like Qumran, near the Dead Sea, where they lived communally, practiced rigorous ritual purity, studied scripture intently, and copied scrolls, giving us the Dead Sea Scrolls. They waited with intense expectation for God to intervene decisively, often anticipating a cosmic battle between light and darkness, and some of their writings speak of possibly 2 messiahs, a priestly figure and a kingly Davidic figure who would lead the righteous remnant. They were preparing for an apocalypse, but perhaps missed the quiet arrival of grace.
So different pictures. A law-keeping Messiah, a status quo Messiah, or none at all. A pair of apocalyptic Messiahs.
Yet beneath these differences, the idea of a Messiah, a divinely anointed one sent by God, was deeply woven into the fabric of Jewish hope. It wasn't a new concept in 10 BC. It had been developing for centuries, fueled by prophecy. Various images existed: a warrior king like David, a suffering servant like an Isaiah, a priestly figure, a cosmic judge. These fragments had coalesced into this powerful, shared, albeit diverse, mosaic of yearning. The land was saturated with expectation.
And this yearning wasn't just confined to these major groups. It touched ordinary lives, didn't it? Even in obscure places like Galilee, preparations were underway, often unseen. This speaks to that quiet submission again.
Absolutely. Think about Nazareth. In 10 BC, it's just a small, fairly insignificant village in the hills of Galilee, not exactly a center of power or learning. Later, Nathanael would famously ask, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" That gives you a sense of its reputation or lack thereof. Yet it's here, in this unremarkable place, that we find Mary. In 10 BC, she's likely just a young girl, perhaps only 10 or 11, just entering adolescence. Her world is shaped by simple domestic rhythms, learning from her mother, fetching water, the daily routines, but also by the spiritual rhythms, the synagogue prayers, the Sabbath observance, the stories of God's faithfulness to Israel passed down through generations. Her life is being formed by obedience, by faith learned at her mother's knee. Her heart, as the tradition holds, was soft, receptive. She was being prepared in profound obscurity for an honor and a sorrow the world couldn't imagine. Her quiet life was the fertile ground for God's greatest miracle.
And Joseph, a carpenter, a craftsman.
Yes, Joseph, likely several years older than Mary. A tekton, in Greek, which could mean carpenter, but more broadly, a builder or craftsman working with wood, stone, maybe even metal. A valuable skill, perhaps finding work not just in Nazareth, but maybe in nearby Sepphoris, which was being rebuilt as a more Romanized city around that time. But the crucial thing the scriptures highlight later is his character. He was a righteous man. That means he feared God. He sought to live according to the law, not just outwardly, but out of genuine devotion. He honored his lineage, which traced back to King David, a detail that seemed irrelevant then, perhaps, recorded in dusty family records, but would prove profoundly significant. His integrity, his quiet faithfulness, his willingness to obey God even when it was difficult and confusing. These were the qualities God was preparing in him for the unique role he would play.
And beyond Mary and Joseph, there were others, the quiet faithful, scattered throughout the land.
Yes, people like Simeon and Anna, whom we meet later in Luke's Gospel. Elderly, devout souls who spent years faithfully waiting in the temple, praying for the consolation of Israel. longing to see God's promises fulfilled before they died. They represent countless others whose names we don't know, old women whispering prayers, families observing the feasts with sincere hearts, scribes carefully preserving the sacred texts. And think of the shepherds out in the fields near Bethlehem, likely descendants of David themselves, living simple, often harsh lives, working in the very same landscape their ancestor David had roamed. They had no idea their ordinary nighttime watch would soon be interrupted by an angelic choir announcing the birth of the true shepherd king. Their obscurity was part of the plan.
And Zechariah and Elizabeth. Their story feels so central to the breaking of the silence.
It really does. Zechariah was a priest, serving his turn in the temple. He and his wife Elizabeth are described as righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. Yet they were old and they had no child. In that culture, childlessness was often seen as a sign of disfavor, a deep sorrow. Their personal story echoed Israel's collective sense of waiting, of barrenness, of longing for fulfillment. But their faithfulness, despite their sorrow, their continued service and righteousness, was its own form of quiet submission. And it was precisely into their situation, their long-held ache, that God was about to break in, signaling the end of the prophetic silence with the promise of John the Baptist, the forerunner. Their personal story becomes a national signpost.
Even the land itself, the agricultural rhythms played a role.
I think so. The cycles of planting and harvest, the laws concerning sabbatical years where the land rested, the offering of tithes and first fruits. These weren't just agricultural or economic practices. They were embedded in the law, constant reminders of God's ownership, his provision, and his covenant with Israel. They subtly taught that history wasn't just a meaningless cycle, but a story guided by God, moving towards a promised harvest. The land itself was participating in this rhythm of waiting and preparation. It helps us see God's truth not just in events, but in the very order he established. The three, the broader world. Converging threads of providence.
Okay, so we have Rome expanding and unknowingly setting a stage, and Judea aching with expectation. But God's plan wasn't limited just to these two centers, was it? The threads seem to extend further across the wider ancient world. What about a place like Alexandria in Egypt?
Alexandria is fascinating in this context. By 10 BC, it was arguably the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, a truly cosmopolitan city, a major port, incredibly diverse population, and of course, home to the legendary Great Library. Crucially, it also had a huge Jewish community, probably the largest outside Judea. And for generations, Jewish thought and Greek Hellenistic philosophy had been interacting there, influencing each other.
The Septuagint came from there, right? The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible.
Exactly. Produced in Alexandria centuries earlier, the Septuagint was immensely important. It made the Jewish scriptures accessible to the vast numbers of Jews scattered across the empire who primarily spoke Greek, and also to interested Gentiles. It essentially put the raw material of God's revelation into the common language of the educated world, another vital piece of preparation.
And this blend of Jewish scripture and Greek philosophy led to some interesting ideas, like the concept of the logos.
Yes. Thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, who would have been a young, sharp intellectual in 10 BC, came from this tradition. He and others were deeply engaged in interpreting the Hebrew scriptures, using the tools and concepts of Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism. One key concept they developed was the logos, often translated as word or reason. They conceived of the logos as a kind of divine intermediary, the rational principle through which the transcendent, unknowable God interacted with and ordered the created world. It was a way to bridge the gap between the perfect God and the imperfect material world.
It sounds almost like they were reaching for something.
They were. They were grappling with profound theological questions, using the best intellectual tools they had. They were, in a sense, groping toward a mystery they could not fully name, as our source puts it. They were preparing the philosophical language, the conceptual hooks, for something utterly revolutionary. Because, fast forward a century or so, and the Apostle John, writing his gospel, takes that very term logos, already familiar in the Hellenistic world, thanks to thinkers like Philo, and uses it to describe Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. John redeems the philosophical concept, filling it with the staggering reality of the Incarnation. It's an incredible example of God preparing even the intellectual climate.
Wow. So even abstract philosophy in Alexandria was part of the setup. What about further east, empires beyond Rome, like Han China or Parthia?
God's stage is the whole world, even if the main actors seem concentrated elsewhere initially. In 10 BC, the Han dynasty in China was a vast, sophisticated civilization under Emperor Cheng. Rich culture, complex bureaucracy, established laws. While seemingly isolated from Judea, its own internal dynamics and the burgeoning trade routes, the early Silk Road, meant that connections, however slow and indirect, are forming. These routes would eventually carry not just silk and spices, but ideas, including, centuries later, the Christian faith. Closer to Judea, you had the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east. In 10 BC, things were relatively calm between Parthia and Rome after earlier clashes. Zoroastrianism was a major influence there, with its own ideas about cosmic struggle, good and evil, light and darkness. They had their own spiritual questions, their own sense of history moving towards a culmination. While they didn't know Jesus' name, the human heart everywhere was searching.
And the Magi fit into this Eastern picture, don't they? These wise men from the East.
They absolutely do. In those eastern lands, maybe Persia, maybe Babylon, areas with a long history of interaction with Jewish exiles and prophecies, like those of Daniel, there existed this tradition of magi. These weren't just court magicians. They were scholars, observers of the heavens, interpreters of dreams, preservers of ancient wisdom. They believed the stars held meaning, that celestial events could herald earthly ones, especially the births of great kings. In 10 BC, the specific star hadn't appeared yet. But the tradition of watching, of studying, of anticipating a world-changing event possibly signaled in the heavens was alive. They were looking. They were ready. And when that sign did appear, they recognized it and undertook that incredible journey west, guided by a star to find a baby in Bethlehem. Their journey shows that God's call reached beyond Israel, drawing seekers from distant lands right from the beginning. So putting it all together, Rome providing order and infrastructure, Judea filled with longing and prophecy, Alexandria developing philosophical language, the East watching the stars. 10 BC wasn't loud, but it sounds incredibly full. Exactly. Not a loud year, as we say, but it held the weight of heaven in its silence. That phrase, the fullness of time from Galatians 4.4, it doesn't mean time was empty and then suddenly God showed up. It suggests something different.
What? Like time ripening?
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's not the subtle appearance of meaning out of nowhere. It's the slow saturation of meaning, the gradual, meticulous accumulation of all these seemingly unrelated details, political, social, cultural, linguistic, spiritual, until the very fabric of history becomes taut, ready, primed for God's decisive act. God didn't just interrupt time, he filled it. He worked within the structures and cultures and longings of humanity. He doesn't need a grand announcement to begin his most important work. He needs readiness. And 10 BC, in its quiet way, represents that growing readiness across the globe.
All these threads converging, slowly, invisibly perhaps to those living through it, but undeniably.
Undeniably. Roman peace, Jewish longing, Greek language and philosophy, Eastern wisdom, all being drawn together by God's sovereign hand. The world, despite Augustus's claims and Rome's power, was still fundamentally aching for a deeper peace, a truer meaning, a more authentic identity than any human empire or philosophy could provide. That ache itself was part of the preparation. 4. The hidden hinge of history, what was set in motion.
Okay, let's focus on that hidden movement. 10 BC, no public spectacle, no fire from heaven, but you're saying there was real motion, quiet motion, heaven's work happening beneath the surface?
That's the heart of it. God's most transformative work often starts silently, invisibly. The significant change wasn't happening in the Roman Senate or Herod's court, not primarily. It was happening in private souls, in quiet acts of faithfulness, in the subtle alignment of circumstances. Think about those specific examples we touched on. The Essenes, retreating to purify themselves and study the scriptures, that was motion, a spiritual preparation. Zechariah and Elizabeth, living righteously despite their sorrow, their moment would come. Their personal story was about to intersect with salvation history. That was preparation.
And Mary in Nazareth.
Mary especially. This young girl, her heart open to God, the soil of her soul, as we put it, being made soft and receptive through simple faith and obedience. She was being prepared for the single most incredible announcement in human history. That inner readiness, that quiet yes forming inner spirit, was perhaps the most significant motion happening anywhere in the world in 10 BC.
It draws such a stark contrast with the rulers of the day. Augustus, Herod, they were obsessed with legacy, building monuments, plotting successions. Their focus was on earthly permanence, stone, and strategy.
Absolutely. They thought in terms of visible power, political maneuvering, grand structures that would shout their names across the centuries. They wanted to secure their place through human effort, through control.
But God's focus was different, smaller, almost.
Infinitely different. While they built empires of stone, the God of Israel was thinking about a baby, a son, not a conqueror arriving with legions, but a servant, a shepherd for his people, a king whose reign wouldn't be based on coercion but on love, whose kingdom wouldn't be of this world, and who would ultimately conquer death itself. In 10 BC, that divine promise, stretching back centuries, wasn't on hold. It was actively being fulfilled moment by moment according to God's perfect timetable, just not in the ways anyone, maybe even those devout watcher, expected. It completely flips our human notions of power and importance, revealing God's truth about where real significance lies.
This really underscores the value God places on faithfulness in obscurity. Those people we mentioned, Simeon, Anna, the shepherds, the countless unnamed individuals just living faithfully.
Their lives mattered profoundly in God's plan.
Mm.
Their quiet prayers, their diligent study of the scriptures, their commitment to raising their children in faith, their simple obedience day by day, none of it was wasted. It wasn't headline news, it wouldn't feature in Roman histories, but it was essential preparation. It was part of that slow crescendo building towards the Incarnation.
It's a powerful reminder for us today, isn't it? That in God's kingdom, seemingly small acts of faithfulness have eternal weight. Nothing is wasted.
Not time, not silence, not waiting. That period of waiting, those centuries of prophetic silence, they weren't empty. They had a purpose. They created a space, a tension, a deep yearning. Think of it as like a musician drawing the violin bow back, holding it perfectly still for just a moment before striking the note. Or that pause a great storyteller takes right before delivering the crucial line. The silence itself shapes the meaning. It builds the anticipation. God was working within that silence, preparing the world for the word to be spoken.
So as 10 BC closes, the stage is truly set. The world is ready physically, culturally, spiritually, all these elements converging.
It's remarkable when you list them. The Roman Empire provides a stable political framework and unmatched infrastructure, roads, sea lanes. A common language, Greek, allows for widespread communication. Cities are connected hubs of thought and commerce. In Judea, the temple stands as a focal point of religious life, even with its perceived emptiness. Crucially, the prophecies, the Hebrew scriptures, have been preserved, copied, studied, translated, and permeating everything is this deep, multifaceted longing for deliverance, for meaning, for reconciliation with God.
The ache and the anticipation.
Yes, the world was aching, consciously or unconsciously, for something more than Caesar or philosophy could offer, and into that ache, joy was about to be born. So 10 BC, that seemingly ordinary, quiet year, it really was the breath before the word was spoken. The quiet tension just before the symphony's resolution, the single candle lit in the darkness just before the dawn breaks.
That's a beautiful and powerful image. Seeing how God weaves all these threads together, it really does help replace that lie of randomness with the truth of his intricate, loving design. It gives you confidence in his plan.
Absolutely. It shows us his plan is never haphazard. It's comprehensive, detailed, patient. He works through history, through cultures, through individual lives, often in ways hidden from human eyes at the time. The year 10 BC is this incredible snapshot of God's quiet, sovereign preparation, guiding everything towards the pivotal moment when he would step into human history in the person of Jesus Christ, revealing our true identity as his beloved children. Outro.
Well, that brings us to the end of this fascinating deep dive into Chapter 5 of In the Fullness of Time. It's so clear, isn't it? 10 BC a year, the world might easily forget, but a year heaven absolutely remembered. A crucial, quiet year in God's perfect, unfolding plan to bring redemption and reveal our true identity in his Son.
And hopefully exploring this invites you, our listener, to pause and consider something profound. If God worked so meticulously, so quietly in the background of 10 BC, how might he be working in the quiet, unseen corners of your life or our world today?
That's the provocative thought, isn't it? What hidden preparations might be underway right now in circumstances that seem ordinary or even insignificant for God's future action? It challenges us to look beyond the headlines, beyond the noise.
It really encourages us to cultivate attentiveness to God's timing, to his often hidden work. Because maybe, just maybe, the most significant moves of God begin not with a shout, but with a whisper, in moments of quiet assurance and humble submission.
May we all learn to recognize his hand, even in the silence, and find deep peace in the truth of his loving, sovereign providence.
Thank you so much for joining us today on The Deep Dive and for exploring this chapter of In the Fullness of Time with us. It's been a real joy.